Hey everyone, this is Pete, and welcome back to the 400 Mini Show, an exploration of the games available for the Atari 8-bit range of home computers. Today's game is Caverns of Mars II, which was developed in 1981 by Greg Christensen, creator of the original Caverns of Mars. It was never released under its original name, though like many unreleased prototypes, it nonetheless found its way out into the wild via piracy groups and computer clubs. 3 years later, the American magazine Antic software arm released the game as Mars Mission 2, with the change in name presumably an attempt to avoid any trademark issues with Atari. While the original Caverns of Mars was a pioneering entry in the vertically scrolling shoot-'em-up genre, structured in a similar fashion to Konami's genre-defining horizontally scrolling shoot-'em-up Scramble, Caverns of Mars 2 is a more direct clone of Scramble, scrolling horizontally and proceeding through multiple distinct areas on your way to your destination. Like its predecessor, Caverns of Mars 2 is technically impressive for its early release date, featuring large, multicoloured animated sprites and smooth scrolling. It's easy to dismiss it as a simple Scramble clone, as there were a lot of them around in the early 80s, but its development in 1981 would have made this one of the earliest takes on this type of game, and a shame it never made it to market until several years later. I liked this game quite a bit back in the day, so I've been looking forward to revisiting it. So let's go play Caverns of Mars 2. Okay, here we are with Caverns of Mars 2 by Greg Christensen. Like I say, this was unreleased back in the day, but it found its way out into the world via piracy groups and computer clubs and so on, but then actually did get an official release by Antic Software, who called it Mars Mission 2, presumably not to tread on Atari's toes, because they still own the trademark to Caverns of Mars. Caverns of Mars, if you're not familiar, was a real success story of early kind of indie development, I guess you'd call it. So Greg Christensen programmed the original Caverns of Mars and submitted it to the Atari Program Exchange, which was an initiative Atari ran in the early days of the Atari 8-bit home computers, where consumers could write programs and send them to Atari and get them published, basically. The packaging for them was pretty no frills, but it was an opportunity for people to get their games on shelves. And Caverns of Mars proved so popular and was so well received by everyone who tried it that Atari actually made it into like a quote-unquote proper game. So they did a proper cartridge release of it that wasn't on the Atari Program Exchange. They did sort of proper packaging for it and a full instruction manual and all that sort of thing. So it was a real success story. So I don't know why Caverns of Mars 2 didn't make it to market. Greg Christensen did another follow-up to Caverns of Mars called Phobos. That again was released through the Atari Program Exchange. That one didn't get a wider release like the first Caverns of Mars, presumably because a lot of people thought we'd moved on by then. But excuse me. Anyway, I don't know the full story, but this is Caverns of Mars 2. Let us play. So this is a pretty conventional scramble 'em up. You don't have bombs, is the one difference from Scramble. You can just shoot with that very high-pitched tweeting gun. And you have a very large sprite as well. And this being the early days of video games in general, that entire sprite is vulnerable. So no tiny hitboxes here. If any pixel of that sprite touches anything, you die. Right, as you progress through the game, you'll see at the top of the screen there's that marker that says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 base. That indicates how far through the level you are. We're currently on Sector 2 out of 5. And each sector is a little bit different. So the first sector has sort of quite jagged mountains that you're flying over. Lots of fuel dumps and these rockets and things that you have to shoot. Then you go over that slightly flatter area. Then this is supposed to be the outskirts of the city. So you see we're starting to get a few buildings now. Whoops! And the rockets are starting to... No! The rockets are starting to launch now, which is something they didn't do in the original Caverns of Mars. They just sort of sat there on the shelves in the cave. But we've got quite a few similar ideas to the original Caverns of Mars in this. Like we've got the sound of the ship. We'll get low on fuel. We've got the sound of the ship changing as you adjust your altitude. Got the fuel gradually running out and replenished by shooting the fuel dumps. Okay, on to Sector 4 now, which is the city proper. Oh no. Yeah, one thing you've really got to get to grips with in this is quite how large that ship sprite is. And another thing to bear in mind is that if you move backwards, if you push left on the stick, you'll see your ship moves at the same speed as the scrolling. So if you've gone too far ahead of things, if you've gone too far ahead of something, you're not going to recover from that. You're not going to be able to sort of make up that position. So if you're trying to duck into a little hole and get some cheeky fuel out of it, then yeah, that's not going to happen. And into the final sector, which is this twisty-turny passageway, where we have to make good use of that fact that you are moving at the same speed as the scrolling to make it through some of these large vertical bits. So it pays to move forward and sort of move diagonally down back through them to make sure the screen doesn't run away with you. There we go, up to the base section, which is the end of the stage. And I think you have to shoot that thing to finish the level. There we go. Congratulations, you have completed your mission. Good luck next time. So now we do the same again, but harder. I forget exactly how it's harder, but I imagine it's more missiles launching, stuff being faster. Maybe the corridors will be more twisty-turny, I don't know. This looks pretty similar to how it was before at the moment. But yeah, as you can see, sort of by modern standards, this game isn't super remarkable or anything like that. But you got to remember, this was made in 1981, which was the same year as Scramble came out in the arcades. And so, basically, almost immediately as we had this revolution of horizontally scrolling games in the arcades, we had both a vertical and a horizontal take on the same formula with Caverns of Mars and Caverns of Mars II. And from what I understand, the original Caverns of Mars was like Greg Christensen's first project. It was like his first project written in 6502 assembler. And for him to come out with a game that was that good immediately is kind of remarkable. Now, I don't think this is quite as good as the original Caverns of Mars for various reasons. I think it doesn't have as much variety. Like, this level doesn't seem to have really changed from that first one at all. So I'm not sure if it even has got harder. But it's still a good example of... Oops. It's still a good example of this kind of game. It scrolls smoothly, it's got nice big sprites, it's got decent sound effects. It's got simple but straightforward gameplay. Which will keep you coming back to try and get those high scores. And it's just very well put together. It's a very competent game. So yes, one might argue that subsequent takes on this genre did it a bit better, added more features, made it a bit more interesting. Like if you look at some of the English software's Airstrike, that's kind of a better game than this, in terms of it having more features and more variety. But there's just some... Oh no. There's just something about the simplicity and the purity of this that I really like. And always have been very fond of. So I never actually played Scramble back in the day. I was very familiar of games being described as Scramble clones, like this, but I never actually played the original Scramble until actually relatively recently, to be honest, because there was no official port of Scramble to Atari 8-bit. That's why there were so many clones on Atari 8-bit, is because there was no official version of Scramble. So lots of different people thought, well, if Konami's not going to do an official version for Atari 8-bit, then I may as well do one myself. So they did. Alright, let's have one more go. You seem to get a different amount of points for those large rockets depending on some sort of condition, but I'm not sure what that is. You get either 300 or 100 points. I don't know if that's dependent on when you shoot it or how close you are or something like that. It seems like it might be random. Or perhaps each individual one just has a specific score value assigned to it. But anyway, let's play through and see if we can beat that last high score of 37,550 points. It still kind of blows my mind to think about people writing games with like little to no experience in programming an assembly language. Like, can you imagine... Oh, bollocks. Not can you imagine bollocks. I'm sure you can all imagine bollocks. But like today with so much reliance on game engines and APIs and whatever, I don't even know if people write stuff in assembler at all anymore. I'm sure some people do. And I know that people who are writing new stuff for old platforms do. Because I know there's quite a movement in the Mega Drive indie development scene of developers who like writing things the way they would have been written back in the day. And so that means using assembly language. That means sort of restricting your use of external tools designed to make the whole process... Oh dear! It means restricting use of external tools designed to make things like graphic design and stuff easier. And some people thrive when constrained by those limitations. And that's great, I think. I think some of the most interesting stuff comes about when people are forced to... Oh! Some of the most interesting stuff comes about when people are forced to work within restrictions of some sort. Because it means they have to find creative ways around stuff that would otherwise be relatively straightforward, or you'd think it would be. My fondest memory of doing this myself was not something that involved programming, because I've never been particularly good at programming. I did a bit of Atari Basic and a bit of STOS and the ST, and that's about my limit. I stopped being able to program when we stopped using line numbers. But yeah, my favourite example of sort of working within constraints and being creative with them was when Click Team released Click and Play, which was sort of a drag and drop video game / multimedia development tool that kind of still lives on today in the form of Click Team Fusion, which is being used for commercial projects. Like the game Freedom Planet was made with it. But one thing I remember being terribly proud of myself for was figuring out how to use player 2, 3, and 4's score and lives as global variables. Because one thing that Click and Play lacked was global variables. So the only thing you could track in Click and Play was score and lives of up to 4 players. And so that, in theory, kind of limited the things you could do. But I found a way of doing quite a convincing sort of top-down action-adventure, sort of Zelda-type thing, where you could move back and forth from room to room, you could explore, you could pick stuff up. And the way I did that, which my friends found terribly amusing, was I put a little sprite of a toilet outside the visible area of the screen, assigned that to player 4, made it so that it couldn't be moved under any circumstances, that it didn't detect collisions or anything like that. It was just a dummy player 4, basically. And in Click and Play, if you put a 4th player in, it assumed that players 2 and 3 were in there as well. So that then opened up the possibility of using player 2, 3, and 4's score and life, and player 1's for that matter, if you were doing a game that didn't involve score and or lives. You could then use those as global variables. And so, for example, I used the toilet to keep track of the room that someone had just come from, of the items that they collected, of the events that they had witnessed, of certain choices they had made. And I remember being terribly pleased with myself for doing that. Because I had been given a restriction, and I had creatively figured out a way around that restriction to achieve something that was never intended. And I thought that was pretty cool. And that's one of many reasons why I find today's indie developers who are creating new games for old platforms really exciting and inspiring, because they're doing exactly the same sort of thing. They are deliberately constraining themselves to something, be it a colour palette, a sound chip, an amount of memory. And they are working within that limit to create something wonderful. This is also why I'm not a huge fan of like those hardware things where you basically put a Raspberry Pi inside something. You basically put a Raspberry Pi inside a game cartridge or an old computer or something like that. And allow it to do something it could never do in the past. And like... Yes, maybe you are technically running Doom on an Amiga or something. But I think that's kind of cheating. It's kind of cheating. Because what you're doing is you're saying... This computer isn't enough by itself. I'll put another computer inside your computer. You're taking the Snoop Dogg approach. Hey, fam. I heard you like computers, so we put a computer in your computer so you can computer while you computer. Or some such things. And, yeah, I mean, there's plenty of great uses for it, and I'm happy that that whole sort of scene exists, and people are doing weird and wonderful and crazy things with old Amigas and Atari STs and Commodore 64s and whatnot. It's just not for me. It's not for me. When I fiddle around with retro stuff, I like fiddling around with the stuff as it was back in the day. Like with the 400 Mini here. Like, one of the things that people were asking for... Whoops. One of the things that people were asking for with a firmware update was, oh, can we have stereo Pokey emulation? Can we have more than 128k of RAM? It's like, yes, they probably could put that in there. Into the emulation. Oh, piss. They probably could put that into the emulation in the 400 Mini. But as soon as you start doing that, it doesn't feel quite as authentic anymore. I mean, yes, I know by its very nature the 400 Mini isn't completely authentic in the first place, because it is an emulation box. And you have a front end. But again, I don't know. I've always liked experiencing new stuff that was possible with the technology of yesteryear. And I think it's cool that all this new technology exists. But I just personally prefer keeping it real, as it were. Because it's still possible to do incredible things with these old computers. And there's plenty of new games for classic hardware that demonstrates that. Like on the Atari 8-bit, we've got stuff like Yoomp, which is in Atari 50. You've got stuff like Binary Parasites, which we saw a while back. And it all stems from programmers like old Greg Christensen here thinking, right, I know how to tell a 6502 processor what to do, so I'm going to make it do stuff. I'm going to make it fly a spaceship over a city. I'm going to make it make stuff blow up. Yeah, this really isn't getting any harder, is it? It's just looping around the game. It's just looping around the game. I guess maybe that's a part of why it wasn't released back in the day. Maybe he wanted to add some new features and didn't get around to it, and therefore the game didn't get released. I mean, this is still perfectly playable in this format, and there's still going to come a point where you will almost certainly die because you'll lose concentration at some point. Oh, like that, in fact. Just like that. I mean, yes, in theory, you could play that forever and loop around for forever and ever 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 and see how long you could go for. But also, people are fallible, as you can see, and they'll eventually mess up. Anyway, that was Caverns of Mars 2. Yeah, I'm still rather fond of that game. It's limited, and it's probably not as good as the original, and there are better Scramble clones out there, but I've still got a soft spot in my mind for it, for whatever reason. I just think it's a nice little game. I just think it's neat. Anyway, let's leave that there for today. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.